Today we are focusing on the impact on slavery and the beginning of the end of that evil institution during the Civil War. I'll talk a little bit about the participation in the lives of African Americans during the war as well. Um, the Civil War is a unique war in many aspects, some we've already discussed, but the fact that it's centered around slavery makes it pretty easy to see that one side on this issue is in the right and one is clearly in the wrong. Most wars, it's not that simple to see like that. World War II is an example of where it is. Everybody can tell that the Nazi Party is an evil organization and in the wrong. The South and their pro-slavery stance is also clearly in the wrong. But just because the South was in the wrong in this war does not mean that some people um, were wholly evil in the way that you would say Adolf Hitler or the Nazis were. So one example of that is having this picture here is these are actual quotes from people. The war didn't start um, with everybody being on one side pro-slavery and the other side being anti-slavery. There was a mixture of it back and forth. Slavery was the cause of the war, but it wasn't necessarily the reason that everybody on either side was fighting. There were people in the North that didn't care about making slavery illegal. There were people in the South that were anti-slavery but still fought for what they perceived as their home state and for their friends and family and neighbors. Robert E. Lee, we mentioned, is one of them. He was anti-slavery. A couple other generals were in the South were anti-slavery, like James Longstreet. Um, and then there were a couple Southerners who fought for the North, despite being from the South, and there are a couple Northerners who fought for the South, despite being from the North. So there is contrast in here. The individuals within the war, there's good and bad on both sides. Though while the cause of the war, it's pretty clear to determine which one is right and which is wrong. When you look at individuals within each side, it's a little different. Now, 4 northern states, as we mentioned, still have slavery. So it wasn't, again, completely based off of anti-slavery, pro-slavery states. 4 northern states that stayed with the Union still had slaves. And there were still slaves in the North during the war. Now, in the South, they were treated worse. We talked about the threat of being sent downriver. Southern states, the further south you went, were more notorious in their ill treatment of slaves. In the South, they continued this during the war, and they forced slaves to provide food, equipment to the Confederate Army. Of course, a lot of these slaves were conscious of this and intentionally were sabotaging or doing a bad job with what they were providing the Army. Now, in the North, just because you were, in most states, free, didn't mean that you were equal citizens during the war. In fact, African Americans were not even allowed to join the Army and participate in the war effort in that way until a little over a year into the war in 1862. And even then, they were not given equal pay as white soldiers, and they were forced to fight in their own regiments consisting of entirely black soldiers, and this practice would continue all the way through World War II. All right, so it wasn't until after World War II was over that they finally decided to desegregate the military. So that is again representing not quite equality in the North in terms of how they treated free African Americans, despite the fact that they did not allow slavery in most of the northern states. Now, African Americans did join the Army after 1862, and they did make pretty significant contributions to the war. One group that your book mentions, one of the regiments, was the 54th Massachusetts. This was personally recruited by Frederick Douglass, included soldiers from all over the North, and one of the first ones to really be thrown into the war and into sea fighting action. Their most famous battle was one of a series of battles trying to capture Fort Wagner in the South, and nearly half of their regiment is killed in this attack. The South will eventually abandon the fort after several more attacks, but their attack becomes a symbol and a heroic moment of the war, not just for African Americans, but for all Americans who see the sacrifice of people willing to lay down their lives for the Union and for the cause of being free. So these men in the 54th Massachusetts become heroes, and they inspire many more African Americans to join the Union Army. I can't tell this story better than this movie, Glory. It is a movie from the late 80s, and it stars a lot of famous people that you may or may not know. I'm sure you all heard Morgan Freeman's voice at least. But it's an Academy Award-winning movie. Tells their story, the 54th Massachusetts, and it's a pretty good one. So if you have time, check it out. Now, as African Americans start to participate in the war more, and as the war starts to turn a little bit in the North's favor, Abraham Lincoln is starting to know that this war can't fully achieve its goals, can't fully be ended unless slavery ends with the war. So, the start of 1863, on January 1st, Abraham Lincoln will issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And this proclamation, this speech, will free slaves, but only in the states fighting for the Confederacy and in territories occupied by the Union. So what that means is the 4 states that have stayed with the Union, that also have slavery, they are not being forced to give up slavery. Their slaves are not going to be freed by this proclamation. In the South, whose slaves are now considered free by the Union, well, they're still controlling their territory, so they're not going to comply and say, okay, well, Lincoln, our enemy, says we got to give up our slaves, we're going to give up our slaves. That's not what they're going to do. So the document, this proclamation, is more symbolic than practical when it comes out. But it still does have some important effects. One, again, because word travels fast in this new modern age of the Civil War, even the people that are enslaved down in the Deep South are hearing of this, and they're knowing, okay, this war that is currently being fought, the result of it is we are going to be freed if the North wins. So they are now given a measure of hope, and a lot of them are inspired to again continue the sabotage that they may have already been doing in supplying the Confederates, or to run away, especially as they hear of Northern troop movements anywhere near them. They know that all they have to do is make it not all the way to the North this time, but to a battle camp of the North where they could be free. So about a quarter of the enslaved people in the South during the war will run away to their freedom. This also made it less likely for any European countries to support the South, because now this war is fully proclaimed to be about ending slavery. Most countries in Europe at this point have abolished slavery, and they are not going to want to be seen as pro-slavery by siding with the South. So this really stings the South in terms of trade and allies, which they are already suffering in. And again, so this just reorients what the war is about. It's always been centered around slavery. Slavery was the cause of the war, but now it's clearly established goal of the war, not just to restore the Union, but to take out this evil institution along with that. Again, not fully, but more so than anything that's been done before, eliminating it in the vast majority of the country, other than the 4 states that have stayed with the Union. Now, the argument with the Emancipation Proclamation can be that, well, it didn't go far enough because it didn't completely abolish slavery, but other people see it as an important stepping stone to getting in that point. That's what your Quick Write's going to be about, so read the prompt and respond to that after you've read this document, the Emancipation Proclamation. Read through it a couple times because it is a little tricky and it doesn't take too long to read through. So, If you have questions, see me in office hours. More than happy to answer them. Enjoy your day.